needed to be stronger. Muscles thickened, his whole body grew, and the seams on his jeans popped. New strength flowed through his body like his cells had become superpowered. He must have healed some because he felt so much better. Stephen shoved the swordsman back and clawed through an arm. The broadsword twirled, but Stephen ducked. The blade chipped into the brick. He grabbed the man's wrist with his left hand. Adrenaline and his new power fueled him. He crushed the wrist, the bones audibly snapping. Stephen saw the fear in Greasy's eyes. Could he really kill this man? Baldy had been in the heat of the moment, almost an accident, but this was cold and calculated. Yes, he could. These men had come to slay him, but he was going to kill them first. Kill them and eat their animus. He squeezed harder, and the sword clattered to the ground in a metallic ringing. Stephen flexed his dagger-like fingers and slashed the man's face, slicing through his eyes and cutting off his nose. Bending, Stephen grabbed the sword and drove it into the man's chest. Blinding light erupted from the pierced heart, and Stephen breathed it into his body. More armor, better armor. He focused on improving that skill, and his left arm scaled over and his hand turned into a claw. Now he had 2 black dragon arms and a fistful of claws. From inside the house, fire alarms took up an incessant buzzing that blocked out all other noise. His housemates from upstairs descended the fire escape on the side of the building. Home invaders, and now a fire? What else could go wrong? Stephen jumped back onto the crumpled hood of the Subaru. Broadsword in hand, he hurled himself back into his room through the torn-out window. The door lay in splinters on the floor. Tessa had managed to get her skirt and top back on before they'd smashed through the door, but now she wrestled with one man, some thick thug with a muscled neck, stubbled face, and a stubbled head. Thug number 3. And at the door stood the guy in the lizard mask from the coffee clutch, but this time, with clearer eyes and more understanding, Stephen saw that it wasn't a mask. The guy had green scales, a leering mouth, and a ridge of spines going up and over his head and crimson eyes. Like the dragons Stephen had seen in his dream, this one had a thick beard drooping from its scales. The dragon man gripped a broadsword in one clawed fist. This weapon, though, was different from the other rough-hewn claymores. A green gem in the pommel glowed and green flames flickered over the blade. The sword might be green, but the fire alarms painted the villain in a hellish scarlet light. Stephen raced forward and drove his sword into the gut of the stubbled thug, driving him back into the hallway. The dragon man cut through the thug and into Stephen's arm. That green sword was magical, must have been, because it cut through his scales and sank into his flesh underneath. The dragon man leered. Stephen growled and clawed through his attacker's face, driving him back into the hallway. The dragon man laughed even as blood dripped down his cheeks like red tears. "Tough guy. Didn't see that coming. Well, the Slayer blade will take care of you, like it's taken care of so many." Stephen raised his sword to defend himself. He couldn't let the Slayer blade hit him again. Blood dripped down his arm and onto the floor. It was his main concern because that wound he felt. The slash on his back and the one on his leg were strangely quiet. The bearded dragon man waded forward to end Stephen. Stephen braced himself for the attack, but it wasn't necessary. A stream of fire struck the dragon man, pushing him down the hall. In seconds, everything was fire and smoke and chaos. The fire detectors in the hallway were silenced, consumed in the blast. What the hell just happened? The scene flashed through Stephen's head, and it clicked into place. A fire-breathing dragon, obviously. But were they friendly? Or would Stephen have to slay his first dragon while his home burned? Chapter 7. First things first, when your building is on fire, you grab your precious shit and get the hell out. Stephen whirled and pushed the broadsword into Tessa's hands. "Hold this while I get my things," he told her. Tessa nodded, speechless, shocked, as she should be. Stephen felt strangely calm. He'd just killed 3 men. 3. They were dead. They were gone. Their families would weep for them, and they would never again drink coffee or eat another meal. Gone. Death was one permanent state of affairs. Tessa went to the window, dragging the sword behind her. "Don't go out yet," Stephen cautioned. "There's a dragon out there. Not sure if it's on our side or not, so better to be safe than sorry." "Burning house, smoke," Tessa sputtered. "We have to leave, dragon or not." "In a second." Stephen glanced around. Nice thing about being poor, he didn't have much to rescue from the flames. The only thing he had that was worth anything was the laptop in his backpack, which he slung over his shoulder. He slipped his phone into his pocket. It hardly worked, but it was better than nothing. The heat from the fire in the hallway washed into his room along with choking smoke. The heat from the fire didn't bother Stephen. In fact, it felt good, like a sauna. It was far better than the hot coal burning inside of him. The fact that the outside air matched the terrible agony inside him made him feel better. He grabbed a few books, including his copy of The Hobbit, and threw them in a box of important papers. He tossed the cardboard box outside. Then he helped Tessa, who was crouched near the floor, to escape the smoke. She tossed the broadsword out. He helped her out the window, then followed her, dropping down onto the Subaru. Tessa crawled across the blood-spattered hood to stand on the asphalt of the driveway. She held the broadsword like a broom. She was pale white, and her eyes were wide and frightened. Then again, she was near two dead men, both of whom Stephen had killed. That seemed like such an impossible thing, that Stephen Whipp could have killed anyone. But what choice had he had? They had come to murder him. But why? Why? He shook his head, confused and uncertain. The magic of 3, he thought. Maybe there would be some answers once he tracked down the clues offered by the pendant. Stephen crawled off the Subaru and stole a look around. There wasn't any sign of the dragon that had breathed the inferno through his house, nor the dragon man with the slayer blade. Good news on both accounts. Stephen went to retrieve his box, but he didn't have to. Arya Kott held it in steady hands. "We need to go," she said simply. "Now." "What about the police?" Stephen asked. "The bodies. I need to fill out a report. I need to tell them it was self-defense. I can't just flee the scene of a crime." Smoke plumed from every window of the old house. Out front, a fire engine pulled up and men clambered out. Sirens were everywhere, flashing, screaming, hardly audible over the sounds of the house burning. The odor of the smoke was stifling. But Stephen liked the smell, which shocked him. How could he like the overpowering stench of burning destruction when all his housemates were losing all their possessions? Poor old man Yank and his wife, all their memories gone. Arya raced forward. "No police, no report. If the assassins are working for who I think they are, you'd be killed in a jail cell." She herded Stephen and Arya around the Subaru, through a gate, through a backyard, and then through an alley that ran next to a house, adjacent to the street. Stephen knew the gravel and glass on the asphalt should be killing his feet, but he didn't feel a thing. Neighbors were out, watching the tongues of the fire leap into the early morning sky. The fire engines were already in action, 3 of them at least. High on extension ladders, firefighters soaked the houses around the blaze, while 2 worked on the main conflagration. A Mercedes AMG Roadster chirped to life, lights flashing. Arya popped the trunk, stuck Stephen's box in the back, and headed for the driver's side. "Get in, now. Fast." Stephen opened the passenger door. Tessa tossed the broadsword in, then pulled the seat forward and squeezed into the back seat. Stephen got into the front, backpack on his lap. Before he even had a chance to close the door, Arya was speeding away. They were all quiet for a time. Stephen breathed in the scent of cinnamon, which mixed nicely with the rich smell of the expensive car's soft leather. A Mercedes. The car was probably worth his entire education plus an extra $100,000 easy. He could sell the car and buy a house in his mom's neighborhood and use cash to do it. Police cruisers raced by them in the opposite direction, but none pursued them. Stephen hugged his backpack to him and started to catalog everything he'd lost. His favorite clothes, that one pair of boots he got in high school, birthday cards from his dad, most of his school books, his TV, and his PlayStation. Ouch. Gone. Up in smoke. Burned away in dragon fire. Now that Stephen was sitting, the adrenaline fading from his system, a myriad of injuries and pains he'd ignored before he began to creep up on him. His jeans were stiff from his own congealed blood. His back and his leg ached like mad, but worst of all was his arm. He checked it, thinking he'd see black scales, but his skin was human again. When had he lost his scales and claws? No idea. There had been fighting, running, fire. Arya. What the hell? What was she doing back? He pushed a palm over the ragged wound he'd received from the Slayer blade. It had already scabbed over, which was good news, but it hurt. Bad. Arya turned onto Colorado Boulevard and pulled off to the side as more police cars sped by, lights flashing red and blue. Their sirens blared loudly, then were gone, hushed, as quiet as the three in the Mercedes. Finally, Tessa said, "I don't have any underwear on. I didn't have time to put on underwear." She laughed, loudly, clashingly, tittering until she was guffawing. The laughter made Stephen smile. Then he was laughing too, and it felt so good. He laughed because he was wounded, and he laughed because he'd lost all his stuff, and he let loose cackles at the fact that he had killed 3 men. Boom, boom, boom. 1 with his own claws, then 2 with a fucking broadsword. Seriously. What the hell? What had happened to his life? And sleep. Damn, he was on his 2nd day without any real sleep. Arya drove on as the 2 laughed like loons until they got themselves under control. "Are you quite finished?" Arya asked. A long, tense beat. Tessa didn't say anything, but then Stephen burst out, "I'm not wearing underwear either." That brought on more hilarity. Ha fucking ha. Arya whipped the Mercedes into a U-turn, heading back down Colorado Boulevard. Where was she going? She hit Colfax, turned right again, then hung a left back on the main street and headed south. Stephen took in a big, shuddery breath and ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. His heart burned like a furnace, and his lungs felt like they were full of soot. His arm throbbed. But he wasn't bleeding anymore. He didn't think. Even if he was bleeding out, though, it didn't really matter. He'd had the best sex of his life. He'd protected Tessa, and he was riding around in a heaven of leather, wheels, and the best of German automotive engineering. There were worse ways to go. His head seemed to be floating above his body. Was he going to pass out? He realized that Tessa had gone from laughing to crying. He reached back, and she seized his hand with both of hers. He turned to Arya, and something slid into place. "That was you. You're the dragon. You breathed fire down the hall. You ruined my home, my life, everything." "That is certainly one way to look at it," Arya murmured. "Another way is that I saved you and saved everything else in the process. He would have cut you in half with that sword, you know." She paused, gaze distant. "It was magical, but where would a skinling get a sword like that?" That last bit seemed more for her than for Stephen. "It's not like we can ask him, right?" Stephen asked. "He couldn't have survived your fire." "He might have, depending on how far along he is in the rituals," Arya replied. "We would be very fortunate if I killed him, since he must be connected to a prime. If we're lucky, it's some foreign prime coming to dick with us. Most likely, however, he's one of Rehagen Mulk's vassals, and in 3 days he'll find you and kill whoever is with you. Except for me. He won't kill me. He has other plans for me." Finally, the chaos of the night got to Stephen. Tessa cried. He got pissed. "Where were you, Arya? Damn it, you kissed me and then you took off, and here I am, trying to do my normal life like an idiot when I have fucking assassins with broadswords coming after me like it's a Highlander sequel, only with more dragon people. That guy with the dragon head, is he a dragon soul?" "No, he is a skinling on his way to becoming a dragon skin. Humans who want to become dragons can become dragon skins. They can shift into a partial form at first, but when they complete the rituals, they can transform into a full dragon. But their abilities are limited. They must serve a prime," Arya sighed. "A prime, like Rehagen Mulk." It was a lot of information to process, and Stephen was having a hard time keeping up. "What's a prime?" Tessa asked in a weepy voice, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. He didn't blame her for crying. The stress they'd been under would have made anyone emotionally unstable. Arya stopped at a stoplight. The streets were basically deserted. It was 4:28 a.m. on a Friday morning. "A Dragon Lord Prime rules a primacy." She faltered, lips pressed into a thin line. Look at it this way. The world is divided up among the dragon kings, and each one jealously guards his kingdom. He has vassals, servants, who fight for him and serve him unquestioningly. Denver is part of the Great Plains primacy, which stretches from the Rocky Mountains east to the American farmlands primacy, which starts in Kansas. Tessa put some of it together. And this Rehagan Mulk is the Dragon Lord Prime of the Great Plains primacy. He is, Arya said. So who are you? Stephen asked. I'm the daughter of Rakshor Khat, the Dragon Lord Prime of Maharashtra primacy in India. But who I am is not the great mystery here. What Stephen is, who he is, that is what I don't understand. After our kiss, I read through your books, your journals, to discover more about your true identity. I left, and I've been making calls and studying ancient texts, trying to unlock your secret ever since. You are a dragon soul, clearly, but raised by humans. Such a thing has never happened. You were hidden, obviously. But why? Not sure, Stephen said. My parents, though, my mom and dad, they would have to be dragon souls, wouldn't they? Yes, they would, Arya said. But if they didn't show you your power, raise you as a dragon soul, perhaps they are human. Perhaps they are not your real biological parents at all. That is my best guess at this point. Stephen, are you pissed she went through your stuff while you were asleep? Tessa asked. I think we're beyond that now, he answered. My stuff is gone, and Arya can do whatever, as long as it helps me figure out who I really am. Arya had a question of her own. Are you going to be angry I kissed your boyfriend? No, Tessa said with a casual chuckle. He wasn't my boyfriend yesterday, and I'm not sure he's my boyfriend now. Even if he was, I don't own him. Besides, I'm not what you would call the jealous kind anyway. Stephen knew for a fact that Tessa was polyamorous. She liked to date lots of different types of people, men and women, at one time. For a minute, Stephen thought about the possibilities in that luxury automobile, but he shook the thought off, as tantalizing as it was, since he had other things to worry about. Now, more than ever, he wanted to talk to his mom. He fished his phone out of his pocket and called the house phone. It rang and rang and rang. No one picked up. Arya, he said, we need to get to my mom's house. If my life is in danger, they might go after her. Perhaps, she said. But it could be they know nothing about her. I was drawn to you because last night you turned 20, 2 decades, and that is a powerful time in a dragon soul's existence. That is why the skinling tried to kill you. If your mother isn't a dragon, she is safe. If we drive to a house, we could accidentally lead the skinling and other assassins to her. We should stay away. Stephen let out a frustrated breath. I keep calling, she doesn't answer, and she's not good with voicemail. Like, she can't do it at all. Can't do voicemail? Ouch, Tessa said with a wince. If I'm such a baby dragon, Stephen said, why would anyone want me dead? You are a male, and you have great power, Arya replied. You see, primes must fight to keep the primacies. Very few males are born. Most dragon souls are women. And so any new male birth is seen as a potential rival. Dragon soul laws are strict about murdering male dragonlings, and yet most of the primes see themselves as above the law. So this Rehagan Mulk sent his lackeys to kill me the minute he realized I existed? Stephen shook his head. That's just great. But not just once. Twice, Arya said. If you were a typical male, Rehagan Mulk might not care. He might see you as a Ronin, a dragon soul male without a primacy. There have been powerful Ronins before, and they went unmolested. You, though, you are different. I know it, and so does whoever wants you dead. So what do we do now? Stephen asked. That is why I keep driving in circles, Arya said. I have no idea. I'd like some underwear and a bra. If we have to fight again, I don't want to be flopping all around, Tessa said. Why don't we start there? Sorry, Tessa, Stephen said. But I think I know what we have to do. He corrected himself. No, I know exactly what we have to do. Stephen lifted the mystic topaz pendant on his chest. As if prompted, the pendant gleamed and the map of Colorado was superimposed on the windshield. The 3 blinking flames flickered in the north, the west, and the south. The pendant map was the one key Stephen had to unlock his mysterious past, and he intended to use it. Chapter 8. Stephen reached out and touched the flames burning to the north along the St. Vrain River. He felt himself called to the north first. Fucking A, Tessa cursed. That's like a hologram. That's like fucking Star Wars, or Harry Potter, maybe Lord of the Rings, moon letters, or some Hobbit shit. That map, how does it work? It's magic, Arya whispered. I asked about such a pendant, and from my sources they said that it might be ancient sorcery. Such artifacts were popular 1,000 years ago, but today we have so much technology, they aren't needed by magicians and dragon lords. Are you sure you don't know where you got it? Stephen shook his head. You know that junk drawer in your house where odds and ends wind up? I swear, I pulled this out of a junk drawer when I was 13. I wore it on and off until I graduated from high school, and then I really liked it for some reason. I've worn it every day since. I believe it is from your parents. Your real parents, Arya said. The man and woman who raised you, kind and loving as they may be, are not your kin. Stephen felt his heart shrink. That was hard to take. He'd hoped his mom was blood-related because he really loved her, and he knew she really loved him. They'd been through a lot together. As for his dad, screw that guy. He'd taken off trying to outrun gambling debts. Maybe I'm half Dragon Soul. Maybe because of my dad. I always knew he was such a snake, but maybe he was really a dragon. My mom, though? She's awesome. She didn't call you on your birthday, Tessa murmured. She'd scooted up between the seats to talk to them and to admire the map. Her memory is terrible, Stephen said, waving away the statement. Or she has been ensorcelled. Or she is dead, Arya said. Then she caught herself. Oh, Stephen, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that out loud. Stephen let the pendant rest against his bare chest. It's okay, Arya. I think she's okay. There haven't been any news stories about anyone missing or murdered in Thornton. I have the neighbor's phone number. I'll call it in a few hours when it's not, still dark. Speaking of which, I either need sleep or breakfast. Both, preferably. Stephen, Tessa said, touching his hair. We can't go to a diner dressed like this. She eyed his pants, ruined and bloody, then ran a finger across his uncovered shoulders. The shirt hadn't made it. And I'm not sure where we can go shopping before dawn. We could always hit my apartment, I suppose? No, that would be dangerous, Arya said. The skinling might be alive and telling Mulk about Tessa. She was in the coffee shop with you when you were shot. They could use her to get to you. Tessa grimaced. Not cool. I'm total fridge material. As in the bad guys chop up the girlfriend and stick her in a fridge. That sucks. But also kinda rules. She shrugged. Guess my life will never be the same either. I have to call in sick tomorrow. Today, Stephen muttered as the full impact of Arya's critical kiss became crystal clear. Or maybe I should just call in dead. I won't be getting to my jobs or my classes until we figure all this out, right? Arya didn't respond. Instead, she flipped another U-turn. Going in circles is making me dizzy, Tessa said. Please, let's chance hitting my place. I can go in the back door, grab some stuff, a hoodie for Stephen, maybe find some shoes. I can steal some from my roommate's boyfriend. He'll be sleeping over. That guy is so loud and derpy when he has sex. He's all like... She deepened her voice and imitated a man. Oh, baby, take all my love, baby. Take it. She rolled her eyes and let out a long breath. I feel crazy. Sorry, I'm talking way too much. I'd be less of a chatterbox if I could get some underwear on my nether regions. All Stephen wanted to do was eat, and he couldn't do it shoeless and shirtless. If they could grab some clothes, they could hit the Village Inn on Mexico and Colorado Boulevard, get a bunch of food, and then figure out what to do next. Arya gripped the wheel in both hands. I would take you to my house, but my own apartment has been compromised. The skinling saw me. Recognized me. Her voice faded away. Her jaw muscles clenched. Determination sparkled in her green eyes. She did another U-turn on Colorado Boulevard. "Okay, Tessa, tell me where you live. We'll risk it." Fear knifed into Stephen's belly, mingling with the burning sensations in his chest. His glands sucked in a fresh dose of adrenaline at the prospect of another fight and more animus. He could feel the power ready to be used, but he wasn't sure how to really use it. He breathed in deeply through his nose and exhaled through his mouth, closing his eyes just as he'd done back in his room prior to the attack. Once more, the shimmering, twisting, opalescent strands of light appeared in his mind. Once more, he focused on the dragon-shaped skill tree he'd envisioned before, and this time it coalesced with surprising ease, far more solid than the last time he'd glimpsed it. Even more surprising, the tree had changed. Interesting. This time around, there was both an experience bar and an animus gauge, not to mention the glowing orb above animus absorption was now labeled partial transformation. Stephen hadn't invested any points, which meant he must have somehow unlocked the ability naturally during his tussle with the skinling and his hired muscle, but he had no idea how exactly it had happened or how he was supposed to unlock the rest. Hopefully the clues from the pendant would shed more light on the situation. He opened his eyes, and the image disappeared in a flash, gone as quickly as it had come. Tessa lived in an apartment complex off Evans, close to where they were. Tessa directed Arya to drive around the back, and she did, parking the Mercedes next to a dumpster. "I'll be right back," the barista said. "I'm going with you," Stephen said, popping the door and sliding out. "And if he's going, I'm going," Arya insisted. "I can't let anything happen to him. I can't. My life." Again, her voice faded, and she offered no further explanation. Of course, Arya had secrets, but she wasn't being too forward about sharing them. She wore a colorful knee-length dress with a cut that showed one knee and kept the other hidden. Stephen reached in and grabbed the broadsword. All three of them walked across the parking lot to the back door of the complex. Tessa punched a code into a bulky metal panel above the knob, then pulled the building door open with a soft squeal. Arya reached down, pulled up one side of her dress, and retrieved a small semi-automatic pistol. "I'll go first. Stay behind me. If we have any trouble, Tessa, you run. Stephen, stay by me." "I'm so not liking this gun thing," Tessa whispered, eyeing the weapon. Stephen, however, felt better. He had his sword, which felt right, though odd. Seriously, walking around half-naked in Denver with a sword? What the hell? But a gun was far less showy and bulky, far more practical. They made their way down a short hallway and walked silently up the staircase to the second floor. The building was quiet, the halls empty. Tessa walked halfway down the hall and keyed into her apartment. Again, Arya went first, pistol in her hand. Tessa went next, followed closely by Stephen and his sword. Was this really his life? After spending the night having sex, he'd found himself in a battle, and now he was on the run with not one but two beautiful women. Inside, the apartment was messy, lived in. A bed squeaked rhythmically at the end of a short hallway on the right. A man's muffled voice filled the air. "Oh, baby, you feel so good, baby. Take it, baby. Take it." Yeah, he sounded so derpy. All three moved quietly through the living room where the TV sat in tangles of wires, Blu-ray players, and video game components. A bottle of Jack Daniels was on a crowded coffee table next to a tottering pile of pizza boxes. Tessa's room was off to the left and smelled like candles and incense. Stephen was relieved to see that she had her own collection of dirty laundry on the floor. Gauzy fabric covered the window, giving the space a bohemian feel. Her bed was a heap of blankets and pillows. Tessa opened a drawer and retrieved underwear. Instead of excusing herself, she pushed her skirt down and pulled her top off. She was naked, curvy, and beautiful. But what really stood out was Tessa's complete and total confidence. She had no problem getting naked in front of him or the strange woman who had a pistol in her fist and could breathe fire. Despite the danger, seeing Tessa naked ignited Stephen's libido again. Arya was taking in the sight as well. Her eyes were glued to the naked girl in front of them. Sexual energy filled the room for a minute, and then Arya glanced away, rubbing at the back of her neck. Yeah, it was in poor taste to stare at people while they dressed, and yet she hadn't been able to stop herself. With bra and panties in place, Tessa dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and a blouse over that. She threw Stephen a gray hoodie, which he put on to cover his new muscles. She also rummaged around and found a pair of pants, which she tossed to him. What was she doing with random denim around? Oh yeah, she had a past. Thankfully, she did, because he couldn't very well walk around in blood-splattered pants. The ripped jeans covered him, though they were tight and a little short. He rolled up his old clothes into a tight ball. He'd toss them in the dumpster outside. Tessa pulled a duffel bag out from under her bed and started to pack, but Arya stopped her. "We don't have time for that. We can buy you new clothes, new everything. We have to go now." The headboard in the room next door banged into the wall. It made them all jump. Then the loud boyfriend was at it again, spouting off, "Baby, I'm about there, baby. So close. So close." Stephen covered his eyes with the grimy ball of denim in his free hand. That was just so embarrassing. "Fine," Tessa said before glancing at Stephen's bare feet. "But let's steal Barry's shoes while he's going at it with Katrina." They snuck out of the room, through the apartment, and into the kitchen. Stephen plucked a banana out of a bowl, his stomach growling in protest. At the front door, Tessa grabbed a pair of big Adidas. They'd be huge on Stephen, but at least he'd be able to get into a restaurant. They closed the door behind them with a soft click. The roommate and the boyfriend hadn't seemed to notice their intrusion, and no one had attacked them. Stephen threw his battle-torn clothes into the dumpster. He was leaving his old life behind. What would his new life bring? Back in the Mercedes, they drove off. Stephen peeled the banana and ate. But it was like trying to stop a forest fire with a cup of water. The hunger was terrible, almost like a living thing inside him. "Much better," Tessa said, adjusting her hair. "I feel almost human again. Next up on my wish list, though, is a shower. And then let the adventure continue." 20 minutes later, they pulled into a parking lot of a village inn. Stephen left his broadsword in the car, and Arya holstered her pistol. In a booth an hour before dawn, Stephen almost felt normal. Not that sitting in a VI with two stupidly attractive women was normal. As he waited patiently for his meal to arrive, he eyed his traveling companions. Tessa and Arya couldn't have been more different. Tessa was shorter and curvier with pale skin, and her hair was dyed dark, shaved on one side. That and her piercings and tattoos gave her a certain look. Arya, on the other hand, was tall and slender with darker skin and naturally black hair. She had a classic beauty to her, while Tessa was more on the alternative side. He thought about how Arya's eyes had traveled up and down Tessa's body. Stephen couldn't help but envision both girls wrapped around him, even though he knew that a threesome was probably never going to happen. Things like that happened in porn, but in real life, people became and tried to avoid the drama and conflict of multiple sex partners. The waitress, a doleful-eyed woman of 50 with stringy blonde hair, dropped off his plate. He shook off his horniness as best he could and tackled the omelet, hash browns, pancakes, green chili, and coffee with gusto. He'd have to use his credit card, which he hated to do, but money seemed silly to think about at that point. This was their victory meal after their fight to the death with the skinling and his cronies. As he ate, Tessa and Arya chatted about school, the coffee shop, and family life. Tessa's brother had multiple sclerosis, really serious, and she helped him and their mother out a lot with the day-to-day stuff. Arya had grown up in a wealthy family in Mumbai. She referred to her Airy, which made Stephen remember his dream. An escort, a horde, an Airy. He was still wrestling to figure out all the new terminology. He took out his phone, got on the restaurant's Wi-Fi, and saw news reports about the fire in South Denver. It took forever. His cell phone was prehistoric. There wasn't any mention of bodies, not a one, and there had been 3. The corpse inside might have cooked away to nothing, though he imagined there'd be bones at least, but the 2 outside should have attracted attention. Tessa knocked him with an elbow and gestured to the mound of plates, empty of the food he'd hoovered down. "Hungry much?" "Yeah," Stephen said seriously. I'm starving. I'm thinking about ordering their breakfast burrito. It's pretty good. And big. That would be your 5th breakfast, Tessa said, smiling. Stephen nodded and drained his 5th cup of coffee. Yeah, I don't know what's wrong with me. He touched his chest. I'm hungry and I have this burning in my chest. It hurt at first, but I'm getting used to it. Arya frowned. You were never shown how to handle the animus. If you had been raised as a dragon soul from birth, this all would have been different. I just don't know how this will work in the long run, and there are dangers. From my research, children who are not trained to handle the power die when they transition from human adolescent to dragon soul adult. A look of worry flashed across her face. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that so bluntly. I'm sure that won't happen to you. Arya was funny. She didn't have much of a filter for some things, like death and destruction, but for other things, she'd clam up. Tessa took Stephen's hand and squeezed it out of concern. I'll be fine, Stephen said, shrugging one shoulder. Or I hope I will. Maybe whatever we find on the pendant map will help me with this process. My, real parents might have seen this coming. I just wish I knew more about them. That was a difficult thing to consider. His real parents. His whole life, who he was, had suddenly become such a mystery. Before we seek out the first fire marker, we should rest, Arya said. From her purse, she removed a wallet and then an American Express card. From here on out, I will be paying for everything. Believe me, my father can afford it. And he hasn't cut me off yet. Another clue to Arya's situation. Why would her father cut her off? Tessa smiled. I was thinking I'd have to shower at a truck stop on I-25, but we'll be staying in style somewhere, won't we, Arya? Arya smiled. Yes, Tessa, she said. I believe we will. The women shared a moment, gazing into each other's eyes. Stephen felt their mutual attraction, and suddenly a world of possibilities seemed to open up for him. Maybe a threesome isn't so far-fetched after all, he thought. Chapter 9. Edgar Vale picked himself up off the back lawn of the house as it exploded in flames. Smoke stank up the air. Sparks and half-burning, swirling pieces of paper settled down on him, but that little bit of fire didn't hurt. He'd just had that foreign dragon bitch blast him full-on with dragon flame. His clothes were nothing but soot. Every bit of his hair was gone, too. He was lucky to be alive, but he was badly burned. He could fix that, though. While the fire engines got to work with their hoses, he slunk away, climbed a fence, limped through another yard, and ducked behind a brick wall as a police cruiser rushed by, lights flashing and sirens wailing. The last thing he wanted was to get taken in by the cops. His prime could fix it all with bribe money and promises of future favors, so that wasn't the problem. The issue was with how his prime saw him. Edgar had fucked up twice. He'd let that weaselly dragonling slip through his hands twice. Mulk would already be furious with him, and if he had to dick around with the local law enforcement, he'd finish roasting Edgar himself. Edgar managed to make it to Broadway without being spotted. The pain was blinding. It was like someone had heated needles up over a stove and then shoved them into every inch of his skin, between his toes, into his taint, through his nipples. Edgar huffed and gasped at the pain, but he had to keep moving. He needed to fix himself before he died. It was early morning and all the legit businesses were closed, but growing up as the son of a hope-to-die alcoholic, Edgar knew how bars worked. For the civilians, 2 a.m. meant going home, but for those bottle soldiers marching toward an early whiskey-soaked grave, 2 a.m. meant going underground. Max's bar, grill, and shithole would still be throwing around drinks to a certain low class of booze hounds. Edgar ran, naked, blackened, and burned, up to the door. The place looked closed. He knew better. He shoved a shoulder into the wood. Using his dragon powers, he broke the lock and staggered inside. The shades were drawn and the place was dark, but it was full of people sitting at stools and congregating around circular tables getting shit-faced. Mostly men, though there were a few glammed-up women who were riding that wrinkly borderline between young slut and old skank. Some big-bellied, big-bearded, good old boy got up to his feet to save the day. Or maybe he'd been looking for a fight all night and finally found one. There was always that kind of drunk, soused and wanting violence. If they could justify it as heroism, fine, but sadism would do just as well. Like a martini with vodka or a martini with gin, both would get you there. "Max's is closed," the big man said. Edgar didn't have time for pleasantries. He shifted his right arm into dragon form, but he was so weak, his chest and head also transformed into his partial appearance. Mulk said his control was iffy, and that was when he wasn't fighting to stay conscious. The big man's eyes widened. "Fucking..." That was the last time the big man would curse. Edgar drove his claw into his chest, squeezed his heart to pulp, then ripped it out and dropped it on the floor. The light of the animus exploded out from the ruined man's body and filled Edgar, repairing his skin and regrowing his beard, healing the damage that foreign bitch had caused him. She thought she could get out of the deal she had with Mulk by joining the escort of another Dragon Soul male. She was stupid. But then most foreigners were stupid. Stephen Whip was a child. He'd gotten lucky. He would be dead soon, and then Edgar could watch Mulk take that bitch apart. The idea got Edgar hard. And there were no clothes to hide his erection. He let the corpse collapse to the floor. The jagged tips of the big man's ribs poked from his caved-in chest. Edgar turned and showed the skanks his hard-on. The drunks blinked stupidly at the death of their friend. Or maybe they were glad to be rid of the loud-mouthed good old boy. Drunks were as funny as they were antisocial. Edgar stretched and flexed his new skin. His muscles popped, rippled. He was back to being his old self, and there was animus to be had. But first, he needed clothes. He bent and stripped the jeans off the big guy. They'd be baggy, but the guy had a belt. Perfect. He dressed. The bar room was silent except for the drip, drip, drip of the corpse's blood hitting the floor. Edgar went around to the cash register, broke it open, and collected up a fistful of hundreds. "Any of you fine ladies want to spend the night with a murderer?" Two of the skanks rose to their feet. He knew why. It was partly due to his display of strength and partly because of the money, but mostly it was his dragon powers. He wasn't a full dragon skin yet, and he wouldn't get serious about starting his escort until then. But even now, women were drawn to him. Edgar grinned. There was a trashy motel down the way that catered to drunks, hookers, and druggies. He'd take these two there, get some more animus, get a shower, and then bring in the big guns. Literally. There were ex-Special Forces mercenaries on Mulk's payroll that Edgar had called in. He had positioned them across Colorado in places where he knew this dragonling would go. And if the cold-blooded mercs failed? His prime didn't know it, but Edgar had met some Dragon Soul Ronins, males without a primacy of their own. He knew at least 3 that would love to get in Mulk's good graces. Edgar could help with that, provided they helped him first. Together, they'd put down Stephen Whip, the foreign bitch, and that other slut, too stupid to know that she was with Stephen not because he was a good guy, but because she didn't have a choice. But first, he had to clear their minds. Mulk had taught him the mind wipe spell for just such occasions. It was how the dragon souls stayed hidden. Edgar splayed out the fingers on his left hand and said the word. His hand burned electric blue. Every straight-up human in the joint would not remember what they'd seen. Edgar laughed and tucked a skank under each arm. He kissed one. She tasted like Jägermeister and puke. He kissed the other, and it was like lapping beer out of an ashtray. Oh well. He figured other parts of them would taste better. Stephen convinced Arya that just driving by his house in Thornton couldn't hurt, and they could let the morning commuter traffic die down a bit. Like before, Arya drove and Stephen rode shotgun. Tessa, in the back seat, had fallen asleep. Stephen's mom still lived in the lower-middle-class suburban house Stephen had grown up in. The lawn was mostly weeds, the juniper bushes were overgrown, and the paint was peeling off the siding. Sections of the roof filled the gutters. It was the worst house on the block, hands down. Stephen blamed himself. If only he had more time to come over and fix some of the stuff. Or if he had had more money. His mom worked all the time at the airport, but that barely covered her bills. In fact, even though it was before 8 a.m., her beat-up Chevy, 30 years old and still ticking, was gone. The lights in the Robertsons' house next door were on, and Dave Robertson was heading out to work in his truck. "Keep driving," he told Aria. He dialed up Kathy Robertson, and she answered with a, "Hi, Stevie." Ugh, he hated when people called him Stevie. He wanted to correct her, but he always felt douchey doing that. Besides, it was the old neighbor lady who had watched him grow up. He could let her slide. The conversation went quick. Stephen asked Mrs. Robertson about his mom. She said she was fine, and the mystery deepened. Why wasn't his mom answering her phone if she was okay? He'd just have to try her at work later. Aria used GPS to thread her way through the neighborhood until she found a way back to I-25 heading north. "Okay," Stephen said. "We need new clothes, a place to rest up, and then we're off to St. Vrain." "There's the Orchard Town Center," Aria said. "Check your phone to see what time the Macy's opens." My phone's internet is terrible. Like, so slow it's not even worth trying." 9. I bet it's 9. Tessa rose and rubbed sleep out of her eyes. "I hate sleeping in cars. I lived in one for a couple of months. It's terrible. I need a bed, guys. Sorry to be the weak link." "Not weak at all," Aria said, glancing over one shoulder before returning her eyes to the road. "You both survived last night? Many wouldn't have." Turned out the Macy's opened at 10, so they had some time to kill. Aria got coffee from a Starbucks, a full $20 for 3 people. An utter outrage, but she just used her American Express to pay. It was like magic. Outside, leaning against the Mercedes, Tessa sipped her latte and frowned. "They got the grind all wrong. This is why you go to local coffee shops, so you don't have muggles making your brew." "So you're part wizardess, part barista?" Stephen asked, cocking an eyebrow. "Don't you know it?" Tessa gently knocked him with a swing of her hip. Stephen excused himself, called in sick to his jobs, and called a friend to take notes for him in his Western civilization class that afternoon. He couldn't reach his mom directly at work, so he left a message with her boss. That was a good sign, at least. His mom was at work. Still, he really wanted to talk to her directly. He said it was urgent. It was a 50-50 proposition that the distracted supervisor would actually give it to her. How much did his mom know about him, the pendant, and his past? Those were his biggest questions. His biggest concern, though? Was she okay? Had anyone come around to hurt her? Normally, Stephen thought his mom was better off without his dad, but at times like this, he wished she had someone to take care of her, to watch her back. They were the first ones inside the Macy's. "Get whatever you want," Aria directed them. "And don't worry about price. We have far more money than time. As long as we're on the move, we should be safe. Don't forget to buy a warm coat, because this is spring in Colorado. Anything can happen. And for the suitcase, don't scrimp. A good bag can last decades." Stephen had never, ever shopped without worrying about cost. He went to the men's section, and he couldn't help but look at price tags. It all became so real. This stranger he hardly knew was going to buy him a wardrobe and a suitcase to put it in. It was wrong. Surrounded by the expensive clothes in an actual Macy's, he shook his head and remembered the crappy house he'd grown up in. Getting jeans from the local Ross had been a big deal. Mostly he got secondhand clothes from garage sales and thrift stores. It had been fine, he hadn't cared, and having to buy the cheap store brand of mac and cheese seemed like a bigger deal. Did he really need new clothes? He was fine in the used jeans, the old hoodie, and the loud sex guy's Adidas. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd gone insane. He touched the mystic topaz pendant. That was real. He'd seen the map. This was his life now. Okay, he could go to the police. He could tell them about the men who wanted to kill them. He could get them to protect him and his mom. But why hadn't there been any news on the dead men? The men he'd killed? Aria had said something about the Prime owning the cops. Stephen found a pair of jeans that were really cool. He checked the price tag and nearly choked. $100. How could he make Aria spend so much? Aria found him dithering. She had a bag and a pile of clothes in her arms. "Hurry, Stephen. We have to figure out things before Sunday night." "Why Sunday?" Stephen asked. Aria glanced away.
I don't know. We just need to hurry. We're all tired and need to rest. If that skinling or another of Mulk's vassals find us compromised, we could get hurt, and people could die. Just buy them."
She rushed off. Yeah, Arya had totally just lied to him. She was involved in this deeper than she was letting on. What would happen on Sunday? Stephen took the jeans off the rack. He sighed. Buying jeans shouldn't be this hard, but it was. For the first time in his life, he was going to accept charity. He was going to get exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't going to care about the price. He needed new clothes for the adventure he found himself on. Arya was rich. The evidence was clear. Exhibit A? Her fucking Mercedes. He didn't look at another price tag. He bought clothes using the mannequins as a model for what might look cool. He grabbed a suitcase and he met up with Arya and Tessa at the cash register. Tessa had embraced the free fashion. $3,000 later, they were out the door and back in the Mercedes, driving off. They found a Courtyard Marriott, and Arya didn't get them normal rooms but booked a suite. The amount of money was staggering. They took the elevator up to the top floor. Arya and Tessa went in first. Stephen sighed, standing out in the hallway. This was his life? Macy's and suites and expensive cars? Could he handle it? He wasn't sure. It was like he'd lived his life in a desert, sipping from an old canteen, afraid at any minute he'd die of thirst. And now he was standing in a lake of fresh water. No, not just water, sparkling water. He strode into the suite. This wasn't a hotel room, it was a small house. 2 bedrooms, a main living room, a bathroom the size of the coffee clutch, and when Arya pulled open the curtains, they were given a view of the freeway and the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Everything was new, beautiful, and smelled fresh and clean. "I was so tired in the car," Tessa said. "But now, after the coffee and shopping in this room, I'm wired. How can I sleep?" Arya smiled and gently took Tessa's hand. "I know what we can do to help us sleep." Chapter 10. Arya stood with Tessa in front of the window that showcased the Rocky Mountains in the distance. The suite wasn't as lush as most of the rooms Arya had stayed in over the years. In India, she had grown accustomed to staying in palaces rented out to dragon souls, and her father had built aeries in the former residences of rich princes. But the room was warm, there was a view, and there was a large bed. It would do. Arya brushed a strand of hair out of Tessa's face. She'd always liked going to the coffee clutch because of this beautiful, witty woman. She loved the way she dressed, how quick she was to laugh and flirt, and how free Tessa seemed. Arya admired her for changing her makeup, changing her outfits, and changing her hair on an almost daily basis. The fact that she had been brought in to Stephen's escort made it all seem inevitable. Of course they would come together to laugh, to love, to fight. It was destiny. Growing up as a dragon soul, Arya didn't have the same sexual ethics that most people had. She was far more open-minded and had experienced a wide array of lovers. This, though, felt different. It was ironic. Stephen had no idea of the work in front of him. Gathering an escort, acquiring his hoard, and building his aeries. He'd healed his wounds because of the animus he'd gained from the fight and his night making love to Tessa. Arya knew they'd been at it for hours. That much was clear from their energy. Arya knew the rules even if Stephen and Tessa didn't. If she had sex with Stephen, she would be linked to him forever. For dragon souls, especially young ones, mating created bonds that were extremely hard to break. Stephen's power was off the charts, true, but he was still so innocent, so clueless, so weak. If Arya gave herself to him and he was slain, she'd never recover from the wound. She wasn't ready yet to commit, but she was all too willing to explore the beautiful barista, Tessa Ross. It would relax her like nothing else. "Can I kiss you?" Arya asked her. "If you don't, I might die," Tessa said breathlessly, eyes wide. Lust radiated off Stephen like a hot wind. She could almost hear him get an erection. Arya drank in Tessa for the first time. She slipped forward and tasted her sweet mouth, breathing in her scent. Their bodies pressed together.
Arya was lean and muscled, while Tessa was curvy and pliant. This was a woman Arya could play with for a long time. Maybe even for a lifetime. Their kiss became wilder, more passionate, and Arya felt the thrill of Tessa losing control. The barista grabbed her long hair in a fist. Arya took hold of her ass and pulled her in tighter. Stephen came up and put his hands on their backs. Tessa broke the kiss. She was breathing hard, her eyes were sparkling, and Arya found herself in the same situation, tingling and wet. The barista turned to the dragonling. "Is this okay, Stephen? It feels right to me, but I know how these things can turn sideways. This won't be my first threesome. We have to talk a lot about everything, or someone is likely to get hurt. Even then, it can still get—" She faltered. "Complicated," she finished after a moment. Arya studied the woman closely. Part of her attraction to the dragonling was because of his power as a dragon soul, but there was more to it than that. Tessa had true feelings for Stephen, and she was a very sexual person, that was clear. The Indian woman had to smile. Again, it felt like fate had brought the three together. Both women waited for the dragonling to answer Tessa's question. Stephen finally exhaled. "Tessa, this is every man's fantasy. You both are gorgeous. You both already have given me the best kisses of my life. Doing anything more with the two of you is kind of hard to imagine. It's like me trying to picture heaven after I die." Tessa squeezed Arya's hand and then moved over to Stephen. "I want this." Arya watched the two kiss, man and woman. With her supernatural eyes, she watched the pair trade animus. Tessa's skin glowed a golden hue, and so did the pendant. Normally a dragon soul didn't need any kind of amulet or artifact to help them process animus, but Stephen was different. The pendant seemed to act as a kind of battery, so his cells weren't damaged by the influx of the powerful energy. And Tessa was special. She wasn't a dragon soul, but she was something else. Something not strictly human, though she wasn't sure what. Not yet. The barista gave Stephen's mouth a last lick, and then she pulled back. "I want this, and I think Arya does too." "Arya?" The Indian woman found herself speechless for a moment. She felt so full of emotion, fear, lust, and love. Already the pull to become part of a dragon soul's escort was nearly overwhelming. "Stephen, Tessa, I want all three to be together, but I can't have sex with Stephen yet. It's complicated, like you said. Is it okay if I watch, help, kiss you both and get you ready? I'm sorry, it's just... I can't." Tessa pulled Arya close to Stephen. "You don't have to explain. Sex is weird and powerful. We'll honor your boundaries. We'll accept how far you want to go. Let's just go to the bed. If I don't come soon, I think I might explode." Arya found herself laughing. She knew how that felt. They all went to the bed. Tessa stripped off the bedspread and started to undress. Arya took that opportunity to kiss Stephen for the second time. That first time, he'd been uncertain of who he was and what he wanted. It had been a test, and it had triggered the dragonling to begin his long journey toward ultimate power. This time, Arya touched the stubble on his face. She gazed into his dark eyes. She smelled his scent and the fragrance of his shifting power, hints of orange blossom, musky cedar, and the char of a fresh campfire. She knew when she shifted she gave off a powerful cinnamon spice odor. His scent was utterly unique and made her heart quicken and her breath catch in her lungs. He was stronger now, taller and surer of himself. His hands rested on the swell of her hips. Her hands were around his neck, and she played with the soft hair on the back of his head. Their mouths grew closer until Stephen closed the distance and brushed his lips against hers. The sizzling power of their connection made Arya growl. Had she really made that sound? She wanted this dragon man inside her. She wanted to join his escort and fight by his side until the entire world worshipped them. But no, not yet. She resisted, needing to hold that desire back, at least for now. Tessa was on her knees between them, helping them out of their clothes, pleasuring first Stephen and then Arya. Arya found herself on the bed, her legs spread. While Tessa gave her the gifts of her mouth, Stephen kissed her and held her breast in a gentle hand.
The heat of their bodies made her sweat, and then she was falling over the edge and into an ocean of bliss. Animus filled her from the wonder of this man and woman. She felt the familiar flow of power, and she felt her muscles thicken even as they relaxed. Then it was Tessa's turn. She was beyond ready for sex, and when Stephen slipped inside her, she cried out into Arya's mouth. The barista's eyes glowed with a bright light that filled the room. Definitely not human, but what? Another mystery Arya would delight in exploring. "My chest, Arya," Tessa gasped. "I get so turned on." The Indian woman gave her a last kiss and then moved to her breasts. Stephen had quickened his pace. Arya reached down and felt where they were connected. A gentle touch, and Tessa was coming. Not a second later, Stephen sank deep inside the woman, stiffened, and let out a cry. Then all three were kissing and laughing in the light of the glowing pendant. Stephen's hands felt so wonderful on Arya's skin, as did Tessa's. They curled up together and fell fast asleep. Arya knew that fighting her desire for Stephen was futile, but before she could give herself fully to him, she needed to know more. She needed to know that, in the end, he was a dragon soul worth dying for. While Tessa might be able to leave his escort, being dragon soul, Arya couldn't. Dragon souls mated for life. Stephen woke up and felt like he was overheating. Sleeping between two women, one a fire-breathing dragon no less, was a sweaty proposition. They hadn't set a specific time, but he wanted to get to the mysterious destination before dark. It was late afternoon and the light was fading in the curtains. He pulled himself off the bed and immediately felt cooler, but not comfortable. The burning sensation still filled his chest. It was like someone had shoved a kerosene heater between his lungs. Every breath made the heater burn brighter, and it felt like his heart was smoldering. He didn't know how, but he knew the pendant was helping him. Without it, he might have already cooked from the inside out. Water. He needed water. He went and grabbed the big bottle of mineral water from the fridge and drank the entire liter. Then he saw the price tag. Shit, it was $10. Why would anyone on Earth spend $10 when water from the tap was free? Rich people were crazy. Definitely. After he'd guzzled down the water, hunger hit him. Eating from the minibar would bankrupt them. No, that wasn't right. Arya said money wasn't a problem. She was swiping her American Express card like it was directly connected to Fort Knox. Either way, Stephen couldn't stop himself. While what he really wanted was steak, he'd settle for the huge Snickers bar and the trail mix with chocolate-covered almonds. Fancy. He'd eaten half the minibar before he realized it. There went another $200. Shit. At the window, he stood and watched the sun drifting toward the tops of the mountain peaks. I-25 was a river of traffic. They might see him in the window, naked as he was, but he didn't care. Just like he didn't really care about the 3 men he'd killed earlier that day. How could he be so callous? And he'd just had a threesome with his 2 crushes. It had seemed so normal, though. It was like he could anticipate what they wanted and how it would work out, and he'd been just fine when Arya said she wasn't ready for sex with him just yet. It felt right. Should it? Stephen crunched through the trail mix, thinking. He realized he'd held himself in check his entire life. He'd had to. Being a poor kid, the son of a single mother, every one of his actions had consequences, not just for him, but also for his mom. Get in a fight at school? His mom would have to leave work early to pick him up. There went money for groceries. Get a girl pregnant? That would mean bills and added responsibility for his mom. Even with that bully bud from the coffee shop, Stephen had held back because he hadn't wanted to lose that job. When you're working every minute of your life, you want to keep things simple. Be a good guy, follow the rules, act like society wants you to, and things flow a lot more smoothly. And once you're used to holding back, acting out, going for what you want, and breaking rules, all get harder to do. When those guys tried to murder him, all of society's rules had gone out the window. It was kill or be killed. And he'd had to protect Tessa. Those guys would have killed her as well. The lizard-masked man had shot at her first. Those fuckers deserved to die.
Stephen felt rage fill him. He relived the battle, and he felt how wrong it was for them to try and take his life, especially now that he had something to live for. So that explained the violence. As for the sex, Arya had started the threesome. Tessa had dived in with both feet, and who was Stephen to ruin anyone's good time? The time for playing it safe was over. Holding back now just might get him and his girlfriends killed. He found himself holding the pendant. It was warm, glowing, filled with animus. He thought about the map, and that triggered it. He saw the flames flickering by the St. Vrain River, not that far away. He saw himself southwest of the fire. His icon was a black dragon. That was his birthright, maybe from his father, maybe not. Could he really become a dragon? Only one way to find out. He went into the bathroom and gazed into the mirror. It was time to unleash the beast. Chapter 11. Stephen went into the spacious bathroom and gazed into the mirror. Normal guy, dark hair, gray eyes, just his own face that he didn't really think about. The burning power inside him flared, and he wished he had an antacid or an ocean of milk to soothe the burn. Were those flames building so he could breathe fire? Or did it have something to do with the animus he'd collected while having sex with Tessa and Arya? He sighed. He'd only been in this mixed-up world for a few days, and already all the damn questions were getting old. Concentrating, he pulled up the dragon-shaped skill tree, and again it appeared blurry in his vision. Wavering, indistinct. It was getting easier to access it, but it was still far from being a crisp image. He could see the skill markers, but he couldn't focus on them enough to read what they were. It didn't matter, though. He knew what he wanted. He gritted his teeth. The Animus absorption skill had been the first skill he'd managed to unlock, triggered when Arya had kissed him. The memory of that kiss still got him excited. No time for that. He had to focus. During his throwdown with the skinling, he'd somehow unlocked a second ability called partial transformation. In his mind, he replayed the battle, envisioning his arm, thick with muscle, covered in black scales, fingers capped by wicked talons. If he were going to tangle with the skinling and his ilk again, he needed to be able to transform more than just an arm. He stared at the skill tree and intuitively seemed to understand that the neck and head of the tree represented his transformations. He focused on the second circle on the neck of the dragon, gaze like a laser, as he pumped his plentiful supply of animus into the glowing orb. The animus bar plunged, and a new tag flickered and appeared on his skill tree. Homo Draconis. The results were immediate and painful. His arms scaled over and thickened. 3-inch black talons sprouted from his reptilian hands. This was not so different from the partial transformation he'd mastered during his fight with the goons, but the changes didn't end there. Oh no. Black scales emerged from his stomach. He wanted to scratch his skin off completely as the itching overtook him, but with his razor-sharp claws, he'd have shredded his body. Agony assailed him. His bones, creaking, cracking, twisting, grew. His joints popped as they expanded. Stephen gasped. It felt like someone had taken a hammer to the inside of his skull. His mouth elongated and slits appeared where his nostrils had been. He stretched his new jaws and found he had rows of jagged fangs. He lashed out with a forked tongue. Holy shit, he had the snout of a fucking dragon. His eyes gleamed. The stink of orange blossoms and campfire became overpowering, like someone was burning down a Florida orchard. His tail burst from his spine and he smacked the wall with it. He'd grown at least 2 feet, now just under 8 feet, and he had to crouch to keep from bashing into the ceiling. He lifted a clawed foot at the bottom of a powerful leg. Half human, half dragon, he was wingless. But damn, he had claws, fangs, and a tail, and he knew he was stronger. It felt like he could easily break through walls or upend a car if the need called for it. He glanced back to the skill tree, still hovering before him, and noticed that keeping this form burned through his available supply of animus. He could feel it draining from him by the second. Tessa screamed from the doorway, naked except for his hoodie. When Stephen turned, she backed away into the main room. Stephen tromped toward her.
He had to be careful as he slipped out of the bathroom. He towered over Tessa. Arya rushed out of the bedroom, pistol in one hand, broadsword in the other, totally naked.
"What is happening?"
Tessa backed up, hit the coffee table, and landed on her butt. She pointed.
"That, thing, there."
Her wide eyes radiated fear, her mouth trembled, her fingers shook like a leaf in a stiff breeze.
"That is our Stephen."
Arya walked up to him and put a hand on his massive, scaled arm.
"So, you have already mastered your partial form and moved on to bigger and better things. Very impressive. Would you like to see my Homo Draconis?"
She arched an eyebrow.
"Yes, I would like to see,"
Stephen said in a loud, rough whisper. Talking was hard, but he could manage it. His vocal cords had changed in the process, but the bigger issue was his mouth. The new tongue, fangs, and lips made communicating difficult, to say the least. Arya put the gun and sword next to the TV. She raised her arms, and the smell of cinnamon mixed with that of orange blossoms floating in the air. Red scales flipped over themselves, covering her body as she grew bigger, taller. It was a good thing they had a suite, because a normal hotel room with normal ceilings would never accommodate both of their draconian bodies. Arya, too, had black claws, striking against her crimson scales. Her small breasts all but disappeared into the muscles of her chest. She was a little more than half his size and far more slender. She touched his arm and growled.
"Your appearance improves as you near your true shape, Stephen,"
she hissed. Her words came slowly, but she could talk far better than he could. Stephen imagined what Tessa was seeing. Two giant dragon people, one huge and black, the other smaller and colored a striking firestorm red. Unfortunately, Stephen's animus was running out. Holding the Homo Draconis shape was taxing him, and his reservoirs of the energy weren't as deep as Arya's. Perhaps as he gained levels, that would change. With a gasp, he changed back to being human, the scales and claws drawing into his body as his limbs shrunk. He fell to his hands and knees, trying to catch his breath. Arya, still half dragon, crouched next to him and traced her claws up and down his back. They felt so good, easing the terrible itching. There was less pain from his bones reshaping, and he could see how he could get used to it in time. He glanced up and gazed into Arya's bright green eyes. Somehow she managed a very lizard-like smile.
"You are stronger than I thought."
She changed back into her human shape. The effects were almost immediate. Claws retracted into fingernails, skin replaced scales, and hair grew over her head as her face flattened until she regained her human beauty. She continued to caress his back.
"You are doing well, Stephen. I can't imagine what you are feeling. I spent my entire life growing accustomed to the animus and using it to change my shape. As children, our kind derive animus from our parents, through their love and caring, though only in small doses. It's not until we can fight and mate that we truly seize power."
Her eyes flashed as she spoke. Stephen rose and took Arya in his arms and kissed her. The electricity between them sparked up at once, and her energy filled him. But it wasn't going to be good enough. He'd depleted himself, and there was only one surefire way to get more back without any enemies to face. Stephen picked her up and took her to the bed. He kissed her as he laid her on the bed. He found himself between her legs, brushing his sex against hers. He wanted her. But Arya stopped him.
"Not yet, Stephen. I can't. Not with you. Well, not until—"
She trailed off, face flushed. Instead, she slid down, kissing her way down his chest and belly. On her back, with him over her, she took his stiff member inside her warm, wet mouth. Tessa came around and got on the bed with them. Kissing Stephen, touching him, she gave him her animus as well. Stephen's hands drifted down Tessa's body to the patch of hair between her legs. She was soft and wet there. Tessa in front of him, Arya under him. Stephen never had a chance. Both the women pushed him over the edge. The pendant glowed as, breathing hard, his mind whirling from the intense pleasure, he collected more animus from their sexual energy.
both of the women were hot as well, so Stephen gave up on leaving the hotel room right away. He had to take care of their needs, first Arya's, then Tessa's. After more sex and showers, they dressed in their new clothes. Stephen felt clean and powerful, and he buzzed with curiosity. He was close to finding the first clue about who he truly was and where he'd come from. To the west, the peaks of the Rocky Mountains touched the sun as it slowly set, leaving a chill. Luckily, they had bought warm coats at Macy's. Arya wore another colorful dress, but accented it with a black camisole and a leather jacket. Tessa was in ripped, blinged-out jeans, boots that came up to her knees, and a black sweater with one sleeve longer than the other. As for Stephen, he wore jeans and a white linen shirt, just like the man from his dream. Arya drove like she wanted to outrun the sunbeams that gave the passing farms and fields a soft glow. They buzzed down a back road, and the Indian woman deftly avoided potholes and passed the few cars on the road. The narrow strip of asphalt ran parallel to the shining waters of the St. Vrain River. Tessa, in the back, chattered nervously about this and that, mostly about the fact that she couldn't believe that dragon people existed, and, maybe even more importantly, that she was having sex with them. Stephen could understand. It blew his mind as well. He had to concentrate, though, on the pendant map. It glowed in front of them. His black dragon icon drew closer and closer to the flames burning next to the river. Stephen tried his mother again. Most likely, her supervisor hadn't given her his message. The home phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. Damn it. His nagging worry was turning into cold fear. "We should expect trouble," Arya said during one of Tessa's lulls. "Whoever is trying to kill you will only be upping the ante. They might not know where we are, but then again, they might. So keep your heads about you." "Roger that, General," Tessa said nervously. "I'm not really the fighting type, but I can warn you guys if I see anything." Then she went quiet for so long, Stephen turned and made sure she was okay. "Are you good?" he asked. She nodded, chewing on a fingernail. "Yeah, you guys know what you are, but me, what am I? I can feel the animus in me, and when we have sex, my eyes glow. I'm kind of torn. Part of me wants to be normal so I can go back to a regular life when this is all over. But then, maybe some part of me wants to be special, too." "You are not simply human," Arya said in confirmation of Tessa's suspicions. "I expect all of our questions will be answered in time. Ah, we've arrived at last." She pointed. A tower rose from yellow fields of dead grasses and the ancient cottonwoods hugging the banks of the St. Vrain River. Arya turned and drove to a gate at the end of a weedy dirt driveway. All of them got out. Their boots crunched on the gravel. They smelled cold sage and the dank odor of the riverbank. The wrought iron gate was as rusted as it was ornate. Spiderwebs, old and new, covered the scrolling metal. The gate was attached to a thick cinder-block wall topped with razor wire. The grounds around the tower had become a tangle of undergrowth, though at one time they would have been beautiful. Lost in the grasses, weeds, and sagebrush were dry fountains and crumbling retaining walls. The round citadel dwarfed most of the bare-limbed cottonwoods around it. 3 trees, however, stood taller. The fortress was 6 stories at least, and was mostly concrete, but near the top were the remains of stained glass windows, most broken, though a few were still intact. The very top of the tower was flat, but had 4 animal heads carved out of marble facing the 4 cardinal directions. "Marble and stained glass?" Stephen asked in wonder. "Who in the hell lived here?" "Yeah, if this is a grain elevator, it's the fanciest fucking grain elevator in all of creation," Tessa agreed with a bob of her head. "It's an Eyrie," Arya whispered. A chill wind blew and she grasped her coat tighter around her. Then she drew her pistol, disengaged the safety, and quickly checked the chamber for a round. Cool, practiced, efficient. Stephen gripped the broadsword in a sweating fist. He pointed to a sign on the front gate obscured with weeds. He went forward and used the blade to clear off the yellow and gray tangle.
A single word in the scrollwork made him shiver. Dracarys. Chapter 12. The sun was gone, the wind was cold, the light was gray and growing dimmer. Stephen pointed at the word. What does this mean, Arya? In my dream, my vision, I guess it was, I heard a name. Stefan Dracarys. Arya stepped forward, frowning. It's an old dragon soul family, now gone. I remember the name Dracarys from my studies, but I can't recall specifics. The Dracarys lineage had a grand tradition, like the Tudors in England or the Medicis in Italy. The last of the Dracarys clan died out mysteriously. She paused, gaze flashing toward him. None remain. A sadness filled Stephen, and he wasn't sure why. Imagining his dad as some kind of king made him smile. Joe Whip was a lot of things, gambler, asshole, absentee father, but he wasn't royalty. As for Stephen's mom, Florence Whip, yeah, Joe and Flo Whip, not exactly the stuff legends were made of. Thick chains kept the gates closed, blocking their way. Tessa stepped forward and picked up the giant lock in a small hand, her chipped and chewed fingernails painted black. So I'm guessing neither of you have a key? I can help with that. Arya raised her muscular arm. Her skin became scales and her fingernails claws. A dark energy surrounded her hand as she brought her 3-inch talons down through the lock. She ripped the lock into pieces that tumbled to the dirt. Normal claws wouldn't have been able to do that, but that shadow energy had imbued her with a powerful force. Arya grinned. Soon you will master your skills, Stephen, and you will be able to do that. That and more. Stephen blinked. Come on, my dragony friends, Tessa said, pushing the gate open. The hinges creaked loudly in the chill hush of twilight. Friends or lovers? Stephen asked, a quirk of a smile on his lips. My dragon lovers, Arya rolled her eyes. Sounds like a bad erotica novel. An awesome erotica novel? Tessa protested. The three stopped bantering as they walked through the gates and past the sage and weeds of the courtyard. Huge double doors blocked their way into the tower. Big iron rings hung from fittings in the central panels, and the entrance would have felt at home protecting a Bavarian castle. What was such a fortress doing in the boonies of Colorado? Arya tried her shadowy claw trick again, but her nails only left deep scars in the wood. The place is magically protected. She squinted her eyes as she studied the door. Stephen fished the pendant out of his shirt and held it aloft. A click echoed through the courtyard. Bolts slid from behind the wood, and the doors creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing the darkness of the hallway beyond. It felt like a haunted house ride at an amusement park. Classic and creepy. Stephen gulped. The whole place had gone quiet. No birds, no wind. A preternatural hush surrounded them. He gripped the broadsword tighter. Don't suppose you brought a flashlight, he said. As a matter of fact, I did. Arya reached into her coat and came out with a mini maglite. She clicked it on and the beam cut through the gloom, showing granite tiles dusty with time. This was it. This was the next stop on his grand adventure. And fortunately, no one was trying to kill him. Yet. He stepped in, breathing hard. Sweat dripped off his face. Lights winked on. Not torches, light bulbs. The hallway led to a round living room with a kitchen off to the side and a bathroom. The place had furniture, a big sectional sofa, dark wood bookcases, a dining room set with 12 chairs around a mahogany table. But everything was slashed apart, the books ripped open like dead birds, the walls burned.